His mother told him how it would end. Thetis, the sea goddess who had tried to make her infant son immortal by dipping him in the Styx, or, in an older version of the myth, by holding him over a fire, knew what the fates had decreed. Her son Achilles would have a long life in obscurity, or a short life of surpassing glory. He would choose glory. She knew he would, before he knew himself, and she spent the years of the war in grief for what was coming, visiting him on the beach at Troy to bring him news of his own death. The choice Achilles makes, Kleos over life, fame over length of days, is the organizing principle of the Iliad and the central question it asks: what is a human life for? Is the intensity of a brief existence that is remembered worth more than the quiet duration of a long existence that is not? Achilles answers yes. He answers it with his whole being, which is why he is the hero the Greeks gave themselves, the figure who embodies the ideal in its purest form. And Homer, who loved him, gave him also the moment in the underworld where the shade of Achilles tells Odysseus that he would rather be the lowest slave among the living than king of all the dead. Even the man who chose glory has second thoughts in the dark. Before Troy, the making of a warrior. The traditions about Achilles' childhood are various and sometimes contradictory, as traditions about heroes always are. The most famous is the river Styx. Thetis, knowing what her son's fate would be, held the infant by the heel and dipped him in the underworld river whose waters conferred invulnerability. Every part of him was protected except the heel she held, the one point of vulnerability that an arrow would eventually find. The story is not in Homer, who gives Achilles no invulnerability and has him wounded in the arm during the fighting. It accumulated around the character in the centuries after Homer, a mythological explanation for the paradox of a man who is simultaneously the greatest warrior who ever lived and someone who can be killed by a single arrow from a second-rate bowman. His education was entrusted to the centaur Chiron. The wise and civilized centaur who was the tutor of heroes, who taught Achilles medicine and music and hunting alongside warfare. The detail that Achilles played the lyre and sang of the glorious deeds of heroes is in Homer. When Odysseus and Ajax arrive at his tent during the embassy of the 9th book of the Iliad, they find him playing and singing to himself, which is one of the strangest and most revealing images in the poem. The greatest warrior of the age, withdrawn from battle in rage, is making music. The two things are not in contradiction for Achilles. They are both expressions of the same intensity of being. The story of his disguise on Scyros, where Thetis hid him among the daughters of King Lycomedes, dressed as a girl, to keep him from the war she knew would kill him, belongs to the tradition surrounding the Trojan cycle but not to Homer's Iliad. In the later telling, Odysseus found him by the trick of presenting gifts to the women of the court. Among the jewelry and cloth was a sword, and only one of the girls reached for it. In some versions Achilles had already fathered a son, Neoptolemus, on Lycomedes' daughter Deidamia. Neoptolemus would eventually come to Troy after his father's death and take part in the final sack of the city, inheriting something of his father's capacity for both greatness and destruction. The wrath. Why Achilles stopped fighting. The word that opens the Iliad, the first word of Western literature, is menes, wrath, rage, the specific fury of a divine or heroic being whose honor has been violated. The entire poem is a consequence of this word, and the violation that provoked it is specific and public and humiliating in the precise way that heroic culture makes humiliation matter. Agamemnon, supreme commander of the Greek forces, has been forced by plague. Sent by Apollo because Agamemnon refused to ransom a captive woman whose father was a priest of Apollo, to give back his prize. He compensates himself by taking Briseis, a captive woman awarded to Achilles as his share of the war's spoils. The insult is calculated and public. He is telling Achilles that the supreme commander's authority supersedes the honor prizes of individual warriors, and that Achilles' glory is subordinate to his power. Achilles' response is also calculated and public. He withdraws from battle entirely. He will not fight for Agamemnon. He asks his mother Thetis to intercede with Zeus to ensure that the Greeks suffer defeats in his absence, that the cost of his withdrawal is felt in Greek blood, and Zeus agrees. The plan works. The Greeks, without Achilles, lose battle after battle, are pushed back to their ships, and come within hours of total defeat. What is remarkable about Achilles' anger in the opening of the poem is that it is presented as simultaneously right and catastrophic. Right, because Agamemnon's act was a genuine violation of the honor system that gave Achilles' life its meaning. Catastrophic, because the application of the principle leads to the deaths of his own comrades, the suffering of the people he has been fighting alongside for 9 years, and ultimately to the death of the person he loved most. The Iliad is not a simple morality tale in which the angry hero learns to control himself. It is a poem about what happens when a man follows a principle to its logical conclusion, and the conclusion turns out to be everything he least wanted. Patroclus, the friend who died in his armor. The relationship between Achilles and Patroclus is the emotional center of the Iliad, and it has been interpreted differently in every age that has encountered it. Homer describes them as the closest of companions, hetairoi, comrades, who share a tent, who eat together, who are inseparable in the social world of the Greek camp. When Patroclus weeps at the sight of the Greeks being defeated and dying, Achilles compares him to a small girl pulling at her mother's dress and crying to be picked up. The comparison is both tender and exact. It captures the specific quality of Patroclus's grief, which is not a warrior's anger but something softer and more openly emotional than heroic convention usually allows men to display. Homer does not explicitly describe the relationship as sexual, but he does not describe it as merely fraternal either. Later Greek tradition, most influentially Plato's Symposium and Aeschylus's Lost Trilogy on the subject, debated whether they were lovers, and the question was considered open in antiquity. Alexander the Great, who modeled his self-image on Achilles, visited Troy before his Persian campaign and laid a wreath on Achilles' tomb, while his companion Hephaestion honored Patroclus's, a gesture that contemporaries read as an implicit declaration about the nature of both relationships. Whatever the relationship was, its depth is beyond question. Achilles' response to Patroclus's death is the most extreme act of grief in the poem, and it transforms him from a man capable of restraint into something more dangerous. Patroclus goes into battle wearing Achilles' armor at a moment of maximum Greek crisis, with Achilles' explicit permission, under explicit instructions, drive back the Trojans from the ships, but do not pursue them to the walls of Troy. Patroclus drives them back. Then he pursues. He reaches the walls of Troy, is struck by Apollo's invisible hand, the god disarming him, knocking off his helmet, leaving him vulnerable, and is then wounded by the Trojan Euphorbus before Hector delivers the killing blow. Hector takes Achilles' armor from Patroclus's body as a trophy. The Greeks and Trojans fight over the corpse for hours, the Greeks managing eventually to carry the body back to camp. When Achilles is told what has happened, by Antilochus, who is afraid to speak, he falls to the ground, tears at his hair, covers himself in dust, and screams. The women of his household, including Briseis, come out and scream with him. His mother Thetis, in the depths of the sea, hears him and comes to shore. It is one of the most nakedly emotional scenes in the epic tradition, grief so complete that it bypasses the conventions of heroic behavior entirely and presents the hero simply as a man whose world has ended. The new armor and the return. Thetis goes to Hephaestus, the divine smith, and asks for new armor for her son. What Hephaestus makes, described in more than 100 lines that constitute one of the most famous passages in ancient literature, is the shield whose surface depicts the entire world, earth, sky, sea, 2 cities, agricultural scenes, dancing, a river running around the rim. Achilles will carry the image of everything the world contains into his final battle. His return to battle is preceded by a reconciliation with Agamemnon, formal, public, correct, in which Agamemnon returns Briseis and offers compensation. Achilles accepts with a courtesy that makes clear he no longer cares. Briseis no longer matters because Patroclus is dead. The original cause of the wrath has been superseded by something larger and colder. He is not fighting for honor now. He is fighting for vengeance. What follows is described by Homer as the most ferocious fighting of the entire war. Achilles moves through the Trojan forces like a force of nature, killing so many men that the river's commander, choked with corpses, rises against him, the river god objecting to what is being done to his waters. Achilles fights the river. He is eventually pulled out by Hephaestus's fire. The scene is mythologically extreme, deliberately so. This is a man who has gone beyond the human, who has become something that the natural world cannot contain. Hector, the death that sealed his own. Hector waits for Achilles outside the walls of Troy. He has spent the preceding days fighting with courage and effectiveness, and he knows, because his mother and father have begged him from the walls to come inside, that what is coming for him cannot be won. He waits anyway. Then, when Achilles appears, he runs. The chase around the walls of Troy, 3 circuits, with the gods watching, is one of the most surreal sequences in the poem. Achilles is faster, he cannot quite catch Hector because Hector knows the terrain. Zeus holds up his golden scales to weigh the fates of the 2 men, Hector sinks. Athena, in the form of Hector's brother Deiphobus, appears beside him and tells him she will fight alongside him. He turns to face Achilles. The fake Deiphobus vanishes. Hector understands he has been deceived by the gods. He makes one offer, that the victor will return the loser's body to his family, which Achilles refuses. They fight. Achilles drives his spear through Hector's throat at the one gap in the armor that had been Achilles' own, the neck, left unprotected by the helmet. As Hector dies, he tells Achilles that Paris and Apollo will kill him at the Scaean gate. Achilles says, "Die." The man who has killed him has also known, from birth, that he will die young. The 2 men are mirror images in this sense, both know their end, both choose to proceed. Hector chose because duty required it. Achilles chooses because nothing remains that he values more than killing the man who killed Patroclus. The desecration and the old king. What Achilles does after killing Hector has disturbed readers since Homer wrote it. He pierces Hector's heels, runs leather straps through the holes, ties the body behind his chariot, and drags it around the walls of Troy. He does this every day for 12 days. The gods preserve Hector's body from decay, Apollo and Aphrodite anoint it invisibly, but the act itself is beyond anything the heroic code permits. The code demands that the dead be returned for burial. Achilles, in his grief, has placed himself outside the code entirely. And then comes the 24th book, which is the reason the Iliad is the poem it is rather than a more straightforward celebration of heroic violence. Zeus sends Thetis to Achilles with a message, "Give back the body." Simultaneously, Zeus sends the messenger god Hermes to guide Priam, the old king of Troy, through the Greek camp at night to Achilles' tent. Priam carries ransom, treasure enough to honor a king, and he carries something more powerful, his own grief. He kneels before Achilles and kisses his hands, and he says, "Remember your own father." He asks Achilles to think of his father Peleus, old and alone at home, who will never see his son again. He says, "I have done what no man on earth has ever done before, I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my children." Achilles weeps. He takes Priam's hand and lifts him. They weep together, separately, for different losses. Achilles for Patroclus and for his father and for his own death that is coming, Priam for Hector and for Troy and for everything that is ending. Then Achilles lifts Hector's body, washes and anoints it himself, and places it in a cart. He gives Priam 11 days of truce for the funeral rites. He promises that he will not attack during those 11 days. He makes the promise with a certainty that comes not from any remaining investment in the war but from something simpler. This is what a human being does for another human being who has come to him in grief and humility. The poem ends with Hector's funeral. Not with Achilles' death, which everyone knows is coming. Not with the fall of Troy. With a burial, and an old king walking home through the night, and a truce that will hold for 11 days. After Homer, the death at the gate. Homer's Iliad ends before Achilles dies. His death is described in later poems of the epic cycle, now mostly lost, and referred to indirectly throughout the Iliad itself. The prophecy is consistent. Paris, guided by Apollo, shoots an arrow that strikes Achilles in the heel, the one vulnerable point, at or near the Scaean gate of Troy. Achilles dies quickly, from what should be a minor wound, because the vulnerability of the heel is not anatomical but metaphysical. It is the point that was not touched by the Styx, the place where divinity did not reach. There is a story, not in Homer, but preserved in later sources, that before he died, Achilles had fallen in love with Polyxena, the daughter of King Priam, whom he had seen at the funeral of Hector. He sent word to Priam that he would give up the war and leave if he could have her. A meeting was arranged in the temple of Apollo. Paris, concealed, shot him from behind. In this version, Achilles is killed not in battle but in a temple, not by an enemy warrior but by an arrow from hiding, in a place sacred to the god who had always worked against him. The greatest warrior of the age dies not in single combat but in an ambush, in a sacred space, by the brother of the woman whose abduction started the whole war. It is an ending that refuses the heroic conventions even more decisively than Homer's poem does. His ashes were mingled with those of Patroclus and placed in a golden urn on a promontory overlooking the Hellespont, where Alexander the Great would visit them 6 centuries later, anointing the tomb and running naked around it in the traditional rite of honor, calling Achilles fortunate to have had such a friend in life and such a poet to commemorate him after death. The poet Homer had done for Achilles exactly what Achilles had given up his life to achieve. Made him immortal in the only way immortality is actually available, in the memory of those who come after. What Achilles means. Every age has read Achilles differently, because what he represents, the question of what a life is for, is not a question that has a fixed answer. The ancient Greeks admired his arete, his excellence, his complete commitment to being the best at what he was. Medieval readers were troubled by his pride and his rage. Renaissance humanists celebrated his friendship with Patroclus. The Romantics found in him the archetype of the misunderstood genius who exists above ordinary social constraints. The 20th century, after 2 world wars, found him disturbing, a man so committed to glory that he watches his friends die rather than compromise, a man whose grief for one person produces indifference to everyone else's suffering. All of these readings are in the text, because Homer was not making a moral argument but presenting a human truth, that the qualities which make a person exceptional, the intensity, the refusal to accept limits, the absolute commitment to a standard of excellence, are also the qualities that make them dangerous, to others and to themselves. Achilles knows this. In the underworld, he tells Odysseus he was wrong. In the Iliad, he cannot stop being who he is. The 2 statements are both true. That is what the poem is about.